Rector Magnificus, distinguished parliamentarians, academics, students, friends. It truly is a pleasure to come back to this august and beautiful hall, one that's dear to the hearts of Latvians as a university and as a place where in the 19th century those who laid the foundations for Latvian, the national awakening movement, and ultimately Latvian independence came here to study, most of them, if not all. I must say that we still have an interesting event happening every summer, of which I am the patroness, where bicycle riders bike down all the way from Tartu to Dundaga, following the path that Krišjāns Barons, the major collector and classifier and publisher of the Latvian dainas, our folk songs, had followed while he had been a student in Tartu, deciding that he wanted to get to know the country in between Tartu and his home in Dundaga, which is in northwestern Latvia, something over 1,000 kilometers, and which, believe it or not, we do have every summer. Some people doing it all the way, others only part of the way, including a gentleman who is well into his 80s. And so that the links between Tartu and Latvia are being thus kept alive as they are in many other ways. Our topic for today is very focused, and I am putting my faith in our panel discussion to actually focus on that topic quite specifically and go into its details and hopefully have interaction with the audience. With your permission, I'd like to start out with a few steps backwards in terms of asking about the fundamental concepts and meanings involved in international aid, international activities, why they are necessary, how they operate, and how they might operate better. The concept of international aid on the scope that we now see it realized in UNDP is no longer, of course, than the United Nations themselves. It is a large body of nations having agreed to a common purpose, and that common purpose being the narrowing of the gap that exists between not just different countries singly and particularly, but between various regions of the world. Ideally, one would like to think of eliminating such gaps. In reality, I think if we could narrow them significantly, we should be happy enough to do so. Ever since the creation of the United Nations, the mandate that it has in terms of its ability to act and to intervene internationally has significantly broadened from its early days. And it has taken on such duties as it did not have before, which have now been clearly and explicitly formulated, such as the responsibility to protect. And this is where, of course, the fact that there are troops under the United Nations banner who have the international authority to intervene in various armed conflicts has played a significant role. At the same time, we have also had very severe disappointments, and I think Srebrenica is a painful case in point, where the United Nations, with their blue flag, had been stationed on the ground, but had not been given the authority to protect and to intervene, and this with bloody and disastrous results. So that the authorization, the resolutions that the Security Council and generally the General Assembly are able to adopt are crucially important in terms of authorizing international action of various kinds and then following up with actual intervention and the instruments to do so. The concept of international aid came into force sooner than the military interventions, and it continues to this day. And you might ask, when do we expect for these actions to come to a term, if for half a century and more they have been going on? What are the results and how do we evaluate them? During his last years as Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan had put forth a serious program of reform of the United Nations. And I had been one of the people he had named as special counselors, I forget the actual title, in order to foster and to advance this reform process. So that I have some, as it were, first-hand knowledge of how such processes proceed. And I must say that the first step seemed to be logically doing an inventory of everything that had been done, and then following it up with some sort of closure, checking whether the aims presented as a program was initiated, whether the aims had been achieved, if so, when they had been achieved, how to evaluate the results attained in proportion to the resources invested in obtaining them, and information of that nature. What we discovered to our horror was that at the time there were something like 7,000 open projects about which nobody had a clue as to where they stood in their progress. And that was rather shocking because, of course, if you added up the sums that these programs added up to, they were truly impressive. And when a process was started to simply tackle them one by one and start going through this huge list and looking at the project and getting information and seeing whether maybe the aims had been achieved years ago, but the monies were continuing to flow to the recipient and so on. I'll give you 3 guesses, and the first 3 don't count, as to what happened. What happened is that loud cries of protest were heard from the quarter of those who were recipients of these various programs, who were extremely happy with the situation as it was, who certainly did not want anybody scrutinizing with any kind of detail what exactly and how and when had happened to the program concerned. Yet, when you think of anything, a program in a university, a research grant that a professor gets, a project in a municipality for building a road or a sidewalk, surely everybody appreciates that if monies have been received, then there must be accounting and there must be something to show for it. It seems rather elementary. But because of the size of the United Nations, because of the politicization of many, if not all, decisions ever taken there, such an elementary and simple and logical step, it turns out, was extremely difficult to do. And so that at the time when Secretary General Kofi Annan finished his term, well, the process had been very painfully started, and a certain number of programs had indeed been examined, and some had been declared as being completed and closed, but a great many remained, and there were loud voices of protest about stopping that process and carrying on. I'd also like to share with you the view from another angle, and that is from down out in the trenches in terms of what happens with international aid. First of all, why is it that we do have international intervention? I think let's start with the basics, with the ABCs. It is quite obvious that when there is a disaster, when there is a war, And you have civilians in more or less large numbers suffering grievously the consequences of such events. Then, not just neighboring countries, but countries far away in the rest of the world feel a sense of solidarity and a desire to help and support. And this, fortunately, just as there seems to be an instinct in human beings for killing each other and mutilating each other and taking away each other's land, property, and liberty, there is the countervailing instinct, thank the Lord, for actually doing the very contrary, going out of one's way, sharing what one has, donating one's time and one's money, and actually reaching out a helping hand. And I must say that I, myself, in my personal life, I can testify to the importance of such actions, since for all the years from the end of the Second World War until 1949, when the camps, the refugee camps, the post-war refugee camps were beginning to be closed, I lived and grew up and started school in a refugee camp, which was largely supported in terms of the food, at least we were getting, and our clothing was supported by private donations of used clothes from the United States, and with monies from, at first, the IRO, the International Refugee Organization, and then later the UNRRA, which took over that responsibility. And I can tell you that for refugees who have lost everything and who have nowhere to go, such international aid makes all the difference. It's actually a matter of survival, and it's also a matter of laying the foundations, as in our case, of having camps where each nationality, the Latvians were sort of grouped apart and the Estonians grouped apart and so on for other nations. The Poles had also their own camps, or sometimes we were neighbors in the same camp but in different block houses or barracks. They were allowed to have their educational programs, and this made a huge difference because the future of these children and adolescents was not compromised, as we see it being done in such places as Palestine or in South Sudan and elsewhere, where the camps are unable to offer either the children or the adolescents anything resembling a normal basic education, which would allow them further to pursue their lives. In our case, when the camps, I think there were nearly 7 million people stranded in Germany, or more concretely in West Germany, at the end of the war, who did not wish to return to what had become the Soviet Union or its satellites, they were scattered to the four winds. Europe was foolish enough not to find room and places for them at the time, and they were truly scattered to all the continents. In that process, of course, we discovered that having gone to school in the refugee camp, in a Latvian school, all my classmates were top of their class when they arrived in a new country. You would have thought that they would be lost because they had to learn a new language and they were in a different situation, and they should have been struggling. And quite the contrary, it turns out that the basic education they had received in, I must tell you, in rather physically ghastly conditions, was sufficient to bring them at the top of their class wherever they went: Australia, Brazil, Venezuela, the States, Canada, parts of Europe, you name it. Somehow all of them, even the laggards in the class, all of a sudden, under the stimulus of a new environment, found themselves doing well. This, to me, is a model for what a refugee camp should do. Alas, more than half a century has gone by, and we see too many places in the world where this is not happening in the refugee camps, nor do we see this normalization of these people's lives by giving them an opportunity to go somewhere, to sort of sink down roots and to take up a normal kind of life. We see generations of people growing up in the same camp and not having any future ahead of them. And this, to me, is a very sad and dramatic situation. In some way, they are sort of frozen in time. They are hoping for international intervention. They are looking forward to going home, and it's just not happening. And in a case like that, much to one's regret, and with an aching heart, as it was the case with my parents, you turn your back on Europe or wherever you are and look for a new life elsewhere. When my parents went to Morocco as a place of exile, they looked on a world atlas and they looked to Morocco and said, well, that's as close to Europe as we can get. It's certainly closer than Australia or Brazil. And when Latvia is free again, it will be easier for us to go home. Now, of course, for 50 years or so, this idea of saying when Latvia is free again would have sounded completely insane to anybody, because said, well, the all-powerful Soviet Union has taken it over, it has annexed it, it has occupied it. There's absolutely no hope of there ever being such a thing again as an independent Latvia. But you see how these things do come about. But what I'm trying to make the point of is that they did not just simply spend that half century sitting in a camp, and that's the big difference. In fact, they died in Canada, where another country we had to go to when Morocco was becoming independent. But the fate of people touched by international cataclysms and armed conflict actually should not be an excuse for their lives being put on ice, for them living in stasis, for them living in paralysis. Their lives should be normalized in some way or another by, if it cannot be done in their native land at the time, then alas, they have to turn their back on it at least for a time and move somewhere else and try to set down roots there. I think this is one of the lessons of the particular case of the exiles from the Baltic countries when they lost their independence after the end of the Second World War. The other thing we will be touching on later in detail is about the kind and the size of donations that a nation can make to the common good. We started out certainly as being recipients from UNDP, and in 1999, when I was elected president of Latvia, I remember taking representatives of various United Nations organizations. The government and the city of Riga had donated a historical house in Old Riga for the purpose of housing all these bodies. And it was with great pride, of course, and joy that a few years later we were taken off the list of UNDP recipient nations and switching over to the other side and becoming donors, not always, alas, of the size and scope that would have wished in terms of monetary contribution, but certainly with sufficient goodwill and also available qualified manpower to make contributions in kind in terms of human hands, brains, and contributions of that sort. In terms of interaction between donors and recipients, I'd like to stop at this concept for a moment. We've seen life from both sides now. We have been both, recipients and donors both. And the interactions between the two, to my understanding, are crucial to the efficiency and the results, the kind and the quality of results of international aid. What is it that one needs for intervention to actually be efficient and allow other countries to follow the path that we followed in a rather accelerated manner, moving from recipient to donor in a rather brief time? And why is it that there are countries that for decades on end are stagnating? They are in this state of stasis, where they are not making progress in spite of considerable resources, both material and otherwise, being poured into them. And the question then becomes, are these countries that are not progressing, are they like the Danaids of ancient Greek mythology, the 50 daughters of Danaus having to fill a recipient with a hollow bottom. And so that you have to, you're pouring water in constantly, but it's pouring out at the bottom. And it's these interventions seem to be like trying to fill a bottomless pit. You give, and nothing comes back. There's no visible result. It has not produced the desired effect. And the question then becomes, and it's rather crucial, not just of evaluating actual specific, detailed individual programs, which to my mind definitely should be done as a routine thing, as a matter of course, but to look a little bit at the principles, the more or less universal principles that distinguish countries that do not progress whatsoever, those that progress very painfully and very slowly, and what is it that they might learn from those who have progressed very rapidly, as has been the case with the Baltic states? Well, one of the things, quite obviously, is that there must be peace in the region, and you cannot have progress in a society, in a nation state, if it's under a state of war with its neighbors, or if it has some kind or another of civil war going on within its borders. And this is what has been happening in many parts of Africa. And it's happening in countries like Colombia in South America, where you have actually armies, you might say, of various sorts, such as in Colombia you have the FARC, the Marxist guerrillas. Then you have the paramilitaries who supposedly are supporting the government. And then you have the narcotraficantes who are a bunch of warlords who will actually collaborate either with the FARC or with the paramilitaries, as the case may be, and operate in the middle of it. But the net result is half a century of basically civil war going on in a country, innocent civilians constantly being killed and chased away from their lands, or in places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the massacres we've seen in Burundi and Rwanda, where people actually continue to be not just killed and chopped up to pieces, but hideously mutilated, even as we stand here and as we speak. I can attest to that because of the fact that I happen to represent Eastern Europe on the Trust Fund for Victims of the International Criminal Court, a court where the assembly of states parties to the Rome treaties, all the ambassadors who sit in that assembly. I have to congratulate Estonia because the Estonian ambassador is now president of that body. What happens in the case of International Criminal Court proceedings is to try war criminals, people having committed crimes against humanity or genocide as individuals, and then the treaties allow for the possibility of restitution or reparations being made to the victims. But of course, so far, only one person has been condemned, and that's Mr. Lubanga. And as, again, you have three guesses and the first three don't count, Mr. Lubanga, of course, has declared himself to be indigent, as have all the other accused who stand before the International Criminal Court. So this is why the nations, the states parties to the Rome Treaty, have created a trust fund for victims where voluntary contributions, these are not donations that are determined in advance. Each nation gives what it feels it can and how much it can. And that trust fund is then held, as such funds are, in trust, overseen by this international board of directors, and it intervenes on the ground in northern Uganda, in the Kivu province of the Congo, and soon in the Central African Republic as well, by offering aid, not restitutions, because legally this has not as yet been established, but offering aid to the victims. And what we do find there on the ground and from the people that interact with the Trust Fund for Victims is truly a horrifying situation where, as it were, international bodies of all sorts are there. The ICC is but one among many. You might say they're tripping all over each other's feet. There are a lot of them. Even the different branches of the United Nations, UNICEF, UNAID, and so on, might be present in the same place. What is frequently lacking is an overall vision of what needs to be done, how to do it, how to get the best results. I think what's happening more and more, that on the ground, collaboration between different bodies who are intervening is becoming more and more the order of the day. It is at the higher levels that you have different bodies taking different decisions, but when you come out on the ground, you see you cannot intervene unless you interact with the people concerned. And this, fortunately, is also one of the preconditions that has been part of the United Nations mandate, is that there are resolutions saying not just that when you intervene in any country, not only must you consult the local population and collaborate with local governments and non-governmental bodies, but there are special resolutions that emphasize the fact that women, who are most frequently the prime victims as civilians, women and children are the main victims of such situations, that women should be consulted and included. This, alas, is not always the case. The sort of intervention that one has needs, these are the brutal, the bloody, the ghastly situations where intervention is needed. What I think we'll be talking about later on is countries where this is no longer mercifully the case, where the country has achieved at least peace within its borders, although we have a country like Georgia, which is, after all, our eastern neighbor, and we know what happened in 2008, so that it could be an illusion to think that they will never be affected by armed intervention. You just never know, alas. But assuming that things are peaceful, that they are not submitted to raids of armed bands, which, by the way, I might mention to finish that topic, why is it that there are so many paramilitary bodies rampaging across certainly the African continent, Central Africa, but also in parts of South America? Well, one of the reasons that one of the crimes against humanity is that Mr. Lubanga got condemned for is recruiting child soldiers. And why is it possible to recruit child soldiers, which is something that was not known in earlier years? It's because of the technology progress in arms and the powerful new arms that are so light in their construction and so easy in their operation that it takes 45 minutes for a 10-year-old to learn how to manipulate them, and that a 10-year-old can actually carry them and can actually kill enormous numbers of people with the greatest of ease. And we have now a new phenomenon that instead of having armies confronting each other or in armed groups, you have children being recruited and children committing bloody murder for the part of those years when they should be out playing and growing up and going to school. So truly a ghastly situation that you have in too many parts of the world. But to get back to countries that have peace and stability, what we're looking there at is a situation of disparity in terms of development and growth. Now, the very notion of development is complex enough. I think we could have spent the whole of my allotted time just trying to get a good definition of what development means, what it is good for, and why is it that we want some of it. But I will try and start with a very simple, elementary definition of a developed country being one that, A, takes care of its citizens to the point of protecting their lives against both armed aggression and hopefully as much as possible from criminal activity. There's no country in the world that is totally free of criminal activity, but at least that the rate of criminality should be sufficiently low so that statistically the ordinary citizen living in any country should have at least a good chance of reaching the average life expectancy that people do have in that particular country. The second thing is that one would like to have, precisely because of that life expectancy, not just to have as small as possible the risk of being killed prematurely, but as small as possible a risk of dying of some sort of endemic or contagious or whatever disease. This still remains a major problem in large parts of the world. If you look at the statistics comparing life expectancies in different countries, they vary even within the countries members of the European Union, and they certainly vary quite broadly, and you can Google this on your electronic devices. The range is really quite broad in terms of what the average life expectancy is. On the whole, on our planet, we can say that it has been growing. It has been steadily growing, and it certainly has been growing historically. For the last 500 years, Europeans have grown taller. Europeans, of course, live much longer than their predecessors, and the same is actually true for most places in the world, but not all, unfortunately. We know that since the Second World War, when the Japanese started eating meat rather than seafood and algae, they actually grew by several inches in stature because of increased protein in their diets. There have been these sort of systematic changes across the world, but what we have not been able to achieve for the last 50, 60 years is to narrow the gap between the richest and the poorest on this planet. Indeed, in even the developed countries, those in the European Union, in North America, certainly in the United States of America, the gap between the richest and the poorest within each country has been growing rather than diminishing within the last decade. There was a period after the Second World War when growth and development was following a nice rising curve, and everybody was getting, if you like, richer each year and getting a higher income and getting a higher quality of life than they had in earlier years or that their parents had, and definitely better than what their grandparents had, unless, of course, they were Russian aristocrats who were thrown out of their country by the revolution. I mean, there were exceptions, obviously, but on the average, for the ordinary citizen, it was a steady improvement of conditions. By the 1980s already, statistics in the United States show a slowing down of that process of steady improvement. And people, even with good Harvard and other degrees in the United States, started getting worried about not being able to sort of keep growing at a straight curve, going up and up and up, getting richer and richer and richer, getting a bigger and bigger house, getting not just one car, but 2 cars and 3 cars in a family, and so on and so forth. Materially, their life accumulating material goods as the years went by, and this forever and ever without ever stopping. This has not been the case, and of course, since the bubble burst in 2008, we have the very contrary. We have veritable deserts of whole districts of Detroit and other places in the United States, where people who had actually acquired homes, much as those after the Second World War, by paying a down payment and getting a loan with a low rate of interest, hoping that their children would grow up in the suburbs, able to play in the backyard and so on, live a better life. This is not the case. Interestingly enough, you see, even as this was going on, in those countries which, since the Second World War, had been growing and had been considered the developed countries of the world, what has been happening is a different gap that has been closing, is that as the Western countries were beginning to slow down, other parts of the world, until then considered rather hopelessly stagnating or not developing fast enough, started taking off, and we now have the famous BRIC countries Brazil, Russia, India, and China, who are showing stable, continued growth when both Europe and North America is going through a crisis, particularly the United States. And it seems that in that sense, certainly in a sense of growth, of an increase in their gross national product, they are narrowing the gap and indeed are showing signs of ultimately, if this keeps up, passing by those who were ahead for such a long time. You might say that the West has been ahead for the last 500 years since it started growing in the 16th century. And now somehow that curve has flattened out in terms of growth for the West, whereas those countries considered undeveloped before, a number of them, not all, are showing distinct signs of economic growth and increased prosperity. How this will turn out is anybody's guess. I certainly am not gifted with prophetic powers, so that I would not venture at all any predictions in that respect. But if you like, the trends are there, the statistics are there, and I think what we can look forward to are rather dramatic changes in world equilibrium in terms of donors and donees, and the whole general situation of where help and intervention is needed, where it is not, and similarly in the kind of intervention that countries are willing to do and to make elsewhere. We do, for instance, find that China is becoming very active internationally in terms of exploiting the natural resources both of the Australian continent, of the African continent, and elsewhere. But frequently they are not doing it with even the sometimes questionable standards of Western mining companies, for instance, and so that in some countries like Uganda and elsewhere, or in Kyrgyzstan, there's certain concern about the if you like, foreign investment, which is always considered as a good thing for a country, but where the kind of investment that is being made and the kind of results it has, the cost for the environment has not been taken into account, and where concerns are being raised in that connection. But the last thing I'd like to touch upon, and I think this is where we will probably continue on when we come to our panel, and is among the factors which are responsible for some states stagnating when others develop. There have been, of course, numerous scholars over the decades trying to put the finger on what is the one factor that plays a role. And many have been singled out, and many have been found, but one, I think, that we're all familiar with is the factor of corruption, or if you like, the quality of governance in that country. If you have a nation state where citizens not just can feel secure in their beds at night, but where they can feel secure that public authorities will take care of them in that sort of semi-parental role that we ascribe to our public officials, that they can trust them to take care of them in terms of providing education, of providing health facilities, of providing infrastructure so that if they produce, for instance, something on their farm, the road is sufficiently adequate for them to bring it to market. They expect to have water available to them so that they can drink it, to slake their thirst and not to catch some deadly disease which will make most children die before the age of 5 or at best before the age of 10. One has expectations of one's country which are, of course, offset by various historical factors playing in that country to its disadvantage, but where one truly major aspect is the inefficiency, the inability of government to fulfill its role, and this at every level from the president on down to the mayor or official in the smallest country village. At every step of the way, when the citizen has to deal with some either elected or appointed representative of the public order, in whatever capacity, if that official does not simply consider it their sacred duty and their task to do the job for which they paid, to do the job which is part of their job description, and that is expected of them, but where they say, well, I happen to sit here, and in order to put up your building, you will need 19 different signatures, and mine is one of them. And I'm afraid that somehow I'm not in the mood today to be appending my signature and my stamp on one of those 19 documents that you need. And I'll have you know that, well, it just so happens, unless you get this one as well, you can't proceed with your project. Your project will be stalled. And the wheels, if you like, get stuck. The wheels refuse to move. The public official is put in place in order to make the wheels run smoothly. That is their job, and that is the public trust that is put in them. But the public official frequently, in certain social backgrounds and traditions, the public official will feel as in a place of privilege which gives them power over others. And you can have the smallest, if you like, clerk or official feeling like a miniature Stalin in terms of the power they have. You cannot cross the border without my stamp. You cannot move here. You cannot do this and you cannot do the other without my stamp and my authorization. And the wheels are stuck, and they need to be greased. And unless the wheels are greased, they are just not going to move. And it becomes such a culture, you see, of greasing the wheel, that next thing you know, no wheel will move its own accord. And you might say, then why do we have these armies of civil servants and public officials, and the state supposedly and the citizen is supporting them and paying them? And yet, instead of being servants of the nation, of being servants of the population, they feel each in his own little field as little tyrants, as little dictators, and they use that tinsy bit of power that they have to block things unless their paw or their wheels are being greased by a desperate public wanting to go on with a project. Now, if there's ever a recipe for stagnation, if there's ever a recipe for a country not growing, developing, and getting better and better living conditions for each generation that comes along and for each person as they go along in the decades of their life, then this is it. Corruption is absolutely the sure recipe to ruin people's prospects for real growth and prosperity. And truly, I think if we are not able to measure it, we know that we have these corruption indices across the world. I must say to you that there, as a former social scientist, that there's a great deal that one could object to in terms of the methodology that is sometimes used. By the way, the first UNDP report that I was handed as newly elected president of Latvia, I opened it up, the nation report, I opened it up at random on a page and I looked at the table, the statistical table that was presented, and I said, gentlemen, this table has gross mistakes in it. You have got the rows and the columns completely mixed up, and these data are useless the way you are presenting them. Well, I got deep and profound apologies and so on, but the fact remains, you see, that this was put down on the record, and that's how it was printed. When it comes to evaluating, I think that the spiel that I always come up with is any country that wishes to progress should invest in its education and certainly in its social science education, because it is social science with its methods that is able to do the measurements that will establish where are we at. What is our true ranking in the world? How much have we progressed? How much have we regressed since year 1 or year 2, etc.? Where do we stand in relation to our neighbors and the rest of the world? And this should be done in a far better way than it is frequently done today. I think there's a lot to be improved just in that regard alone. Simply the measurement of where we stand and the techniques for doing so could be much improved. But having, once we have, of course, a rough idea of where we stand, I think then it is a decision of each country and its citizens to decide, first of all, for itself, what is it that I want to ask my politicians, my elected representatives, the businessmen in my country and so on, where are we going? What is it that we wish to achieve? And also to have some sense and some idea of where we stand in the world. And I think this is where UNDP and the various international bodies play an irreplaceable role. They are the ones who do try, sometimes better and sometimes worse, but they do try and take the global view of our whole planet. It is crucial for each of us and for each country to realize where do we stand in the overall picture. It is crucial for us to see what are the trends worldwide, not just within the European Union, not within our own region, and not within our own country, but what are the trends in a broader sense, so that we have an idea and some kind of feeling for how we should establish our aims, our goals, and our strategies and tactics for reaching them. It is a constant process of feedback, I think, that nations have to go through, constantly evaluating the quality and the quantity of all the indicators that represent a country, constantly re-evaluating the programs that we ourselves have for ourselves, and yes, on the international plane as well, a constant critical attitude, benevolently critical, but yet one evaluating which projects are more hopeful, which ones in the past have given good results, where do we have a bottomless pit that doesn't seem to give any results, and where, on the contrary, we have marvelous inventivity and creativity in terms of doing things originally in a way that was never done before and achieving remarkable results in a very short time. One of the cases being microcredit, for instance, in Bangladesh, and from then on in many other countries. So, ladies and gentlemen, with this, I think I would like to stop my intervention, and we will then hopefully focus on this particular region and its neighbor in a panel that follows. Thank you for your attention.